Here are all the topics covered in the US political parties revision videos. This video will cover realigning elections.
We now need to look at realigning elections. Realigning elections is a term from political science and political history describing a dramatic change in the political system. This usually means the coming to power for several decades of a new coalition, replacing an old dominant coalition of the other party. This refers to American national elections in which there are sharp changes in issues, party leaders, regional and demographic bases of power of the two parties, and structure or rules of the political system, such as voter eligibility or financing. This results in new political power structures that last for decades.
First developed by political scientist V. O. Key Jr. in 1995 in an article called A Theory of Critical Elections. He stated that American elections, parties, and policy making routinely shift in swift, dramatic sweeps, as shown in a single critical election. Differences in opinion about how often realigning elections take place. The general consensus is that there's a regular schedule once every 36 years or so. This period of roughly 30 years fits with the notion that these cycles are closely linked to generational changes. Here is the generally agreed upon list of what constitutes a realigned election. There is also a debatable list, as you can see here as well. To find a truly realigning single election, one must go back to 1932. For most of the previous 30 years, the Republicans had been the dominant party. They had won 3 presidential elections in a row, including a virtual clean sweep outside the Solid South in 1928. This was completely flipped in the presidential election of 1932. It was a significant election, not just because the Depression had begun under Republican President Herbert Hoover's watch, but it also had much to do with the party's response. Hoover failed adequately to address the crisis effectively or dynamically, a case of too little too late. Meanwhile, the Democrats nominated New York Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had a solid reputation of his own, having mobilized his state government much more effectively to fight the impact of depression. The economic crisis and the unprecedented rise in unemployment and poverty were the reasons behind the complete turnaround in party support. Hoover and the Republicans had gained much popularity during the boom years of the 1920s by minimizing government involvement and regulation of business and banking sectors. However, there was much reckless lending and an artificial inflation of stock values. When the 1929 Wall Street crash hit the USA, it took the Republicans and their laissez-faire economics with them. By any measure, the election represented a dramatic change in political fortunes. In 1928, the Republicans had won by a margin of over 6 million votes and by 447 electoral college votes to 87. In 1932, Roosevelt and the Democrats won by 7 million votes and by 472 to 59 electoral college votes. Roosevelt promised a far more interventionist government, a New Deal, though without going into great detail into his campaigning. Due to Hoover's huge unpopularity over the economic downturn, Roosevelt simply had to avoid making any major gaffes and to relentlessly attack the inadequacies of his opponent. Crucially, he also built up a broad coalition of voters, termed the New Deal Coalition. This combined conservative Southern Protestants, often known as Dixiecrats, Northern Jews, Catholics, and the urban African American population, as well as labor union members, small farmers, and radicals. The broad grouping enabled the Democrats to dominate US politics well up until the 1960s. Aside from Dwight D. Eisenhower, every US president between 1932 and 1968 was a Democrat. The party also controlled both houses of Congress for nearly this entire period. It controlled the Senate for all but 4 years between 1932 and 1980. This dominant voter coalition began to break up in the 1960s, largely as a result of the Civil Rights Movement, when the support for civil rights legislation by President Johnson effectively signed away the South for the Democrats. In many ways, it is still too early to tell if 2016 will in the long term provide to be a realigning election, but there are certainly grounds for suggesting that it marks some significant shifts in voting behaviour, although in part this may reflect the personalities of the two main candidates. Clinton was widely seen as a political insider, which arguably limited her appeal among white-blue college voters, especially in the Rust Belt, where Trump picked up several key states, including Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Among its key features were the following. It was the first example since Eisenhower in 1952 of victory by a political outsider.
In addition, Trump couldn't boast of a record of distinguished military or public service in any other areas that Eisenhower could. It was generally viewed as a victory for populism over experience and mainstream politicians. On the Democrat side, outsider candidate Bernie Sanders came quite close to defeating Hillary Clinton in the primaries. Many previously loyal Democrat white blue-collar workers in the Rust Belt states such as Michigan and Ohio swung behind Trump, attracted by his promises of more jobs and trade. It was his victories in states such as Wisconsin that pushed Trump over the winning line in 2016, despite him losing the popular vote. It revealed the growing gap between the urban and multi-ethnic USA and the largely white ex-urban small-town rural USA. Each voted in record numbers for their candidate. However, the main shifts in voting behaviour need to be carefully analysed. Many voter blocs roughly stayed the same as 2012. For example, white evangelicals remained largely loyal to the Republican candidate, despite Trump's well-published moral lapses, including several affairs. Equally, African Americans continued overwhelmingly to back the Democrats. The main change was among the less well-educated white people in upper Midwest states such as Michigan and Wisconsin, and also Ohio. For example, white voters in Ohio went for Trump, 62% to 33%, a considerable improvement from 2012 when Romney won 57% of the white vote. The biggest shift in a single country there was in Monroe County, where the Republican vote shot up from 52% to 72%.